In the 14th century, an entire European community just vanished from the edge of the known world. They didn't leave behind any bodies, no signs of a fight, just an eerie silence. And this is the story of that disappearance. So let's set the scene. The year is 1341. A priest, a guy named Ivar Barderson, is carefully guiding his ship through a remote fjord in Greenland. He's not there by chance. He's on a rescue mission. You see, for years, the Norse colonists who lived here hadn't sent any ships, any letters, any goods. There was just silence. So Bardison's mission, given to him by the bishop, was pretty straightforward, but also kind of grim. Find out what in the world happened to the Western settlement. This place was the most remote outpost of European life, and it had basically just dropped off the face of the earth. But when he and his crew finally stepped ashore, what they found was not at all what they were expecting. There were no ruins, no signs of some epic battle. Instead, they found a village that was perfectly intact. The houses were still standing, the church was untouched, and wandering in the fields was livestock, completely unattended. There were just no people. This whole scene leaves us with this incredible, haunting puzzle. First, why the silence? Second, where were all the bodies? And maybe the weirdest question of all, why were the animals still alive and just grazing in the fields? Okay, so to even start to unpack those questions, we really have to get our heads around just how precarious their life was. This was truly life at the very, very edge of the known world. You see, the Western settlement wasn't just remote. It was on the absolute razor's edge of what was even possible. This was the northernmost limit for medieval farming, period. We're talking about a small cluster of turf farms, basically clinging to life around a fjord, almost totally cut off from the rest of the world. And for generations, they actually pulled off this incredible balancing act, living a European life in a harsh Arctic world. But then that connection started to fray. The very last confirmed contact was a shipment of walrus ivory that made it to Norway in 1327. And after that, nothing. 14 years of complete silence went by before Barderson was finally sent to figure out why. Barderson probably sailed in there expecting to find answers, right? Maybe a story of some terrible disaster. But what he found wasn't destruction, it was just absence. A perfectly functional little village with nobody left to live in it. So let's play detective here. What can the actual evidence, the clues left behind in all that silence, really tell us about what went down? All right. Think about all the strange things Bardarson's crew saw that day. Out of everything, what do you think was the single most important clue they stumbled upon? Well, it all comes down to one simple number: 1. In Greenland's brutal climate, livestock can't survive a single winter without human help. So the fact that these animals were still alive, that meant the people had to have vanished very, very recently. We're talking within the last year. This wasn't some old, cold case. It was fresh. Now, Bardarson's mind immediately jumped to one conclusion: an attack. He figured the local Inuit, who the Norse called Skraelings, must have killed the settlers. But the physical evidence, it told a totally different and much quieter story. There were no signs of violence, no burned down buildings, no bodies. This didn't look like a massacre at all. And what's really interesting is that later archaeology totally backs this up. Valuable stuff that you could carry was gone. The doors to the homes were properly closed. Tools were put away where they belonged. And the church left completely untouched. This wasn't a panicked run for their lives. No, this looks way more like a planned departure, an organized evacuation. Okay, so if we're working with the theory that this was a planned evacuation, the next big question is, well, where did they go? What was their final voyage? Well, we can be pretty sure they didn't sail east. No huge wave of Greenlandic refugees ever showed up in Iceland or Norway. So if they weren't killed, and they didn't go east, there was really only one direction left to go: west. And here's the thing. West wasn't just some big, scary unknown. For centuries, the Norse had known about the forested coasts of North America. They even had a name for it: Markland. It was a known, and more importantly, a reachable destination. There's even this one Icelandic chronicle from around that time that makes this wild claim that the Greenlanders basically abandoned their faith and went to the people of America. Now, sure, this could just be a legend, but it tells you that this idea was in the air, but people were already talking about it at the time. So when you start adding it all up, you've got the climate getting worse, what we now call the Little Ice Age. You've got trade with Europe basically drying up, and this really deep feeling of isolation. The choice to leave starts to seem, well, almost logical, doesn't it? Faced with a world that was feeling them, they may have chosen a known world to the west, a land full of trees, timber, and new opportunities. And this completely reframes the whole mystery. Maybe it's not a story about a people who vanished, but about a community that made a conscious choice to leave their world behind. But let's go back to that fjord for a second. Ivar Barterson and his crew, they weren't thinking about any of this. They weren't trying to solve some big historical mystery. They were practical men in a very unforgiving place, and they were focused on one thing: survival. They knew those abandoned animals, the cattle and sheep, they had no chance of surviving the next winter on their own. So in one final practical act, they slaughtered the animals, they took the meat, and they sailed away, using the very last resources of this vanished community to make sure they themselves would survive. And just like that, the story of the Norse in the Western settlement, it comes to an end. The empty turf houses were left to the wind, the church was left to the snow. Europeans never settled there again, and the fjord finally got its silence back. And that's what makes the story so powerful, you know? It's this reminder that not every ending is some big, violent collapse. Some civilizations don't go out in a blaze of fire and conquest. They reach a point where their world doesn't work for them anymore, and they make the choice to go find a new one. Look, we'll probably never know for sure what happened to them. Maybe they were lost at sea, or maybe they stepped ashore in a new land and started all over again. But their story leaves us with this really profound question to think about. When is walking away from everything you've ever known not an end, but actually the start of a new beginning?